So my name is Dr. Keryn Johnson. I have 4 degrees. So I have a PhD in biochemistry, a master's in molecular genetics, a BSc double major plant and microbial sciences and biochemistry. I've had 18 years as a research scientist for the New Zealand government, developing regenerative medicine technologies for a variety of different companies in New Zealand. I guess my foray out of traditional biochemistry and into the field of quantum biology has been an attempt by myself to really reconcile my own spiritual healing that I received back in 2013 at church, and my deep logical based scientific understanding, and I guess what I've been taught over the years in relation to the world of materialism that Western science teachers. So I've gone on a bit of a journey in order to reconcile those two models back together, and that culminated in a discovery of atomic light in a radioactive decay event that provided me with the energy and insight to essentially turn everything on its head, flip it 180, and start looking at the mechanistic logical processes that are operating within the mind, and the light within the mind being produced in a way that is, not currently accepted by neurologists or biochemists. We have a scientific model that explains the external world very well, but we do not have a very good scientific model to explain the light that we see and consciousness. So I've used an approach which is, a little bit paradoxical in terms of looking at biology through that lens of physics, and then applying the concepts of physics into the concepts of biology in order to kind of give me a different model to explore. And then I've come up with some, insightful approaches to rationalize the experience that I've had in order to kind of integrate that back into the scientific understanding that I've developed. So in an attempt, it was such a profound experience that I wanted to be able to provide context for that experience in a Western scientific model, and in doing so have shifted science away from an external materialism into a electromagnetic geometry based on orbital layers within the structure of an atom, so the electromagnetic field, and understanding the layer that we're observing within the mind is essentially the second layer, the Balmer line transitions of electrons, which give visible wavelengths of light. So if we kind of step back a little bit from that and explore just the anatomy of the human eye to begin with, and how the rods and cones are pointed inwards. So we have an inverted retina that looks inward, and we can, rationalize that through understanding. We see our dreams at night with our eyes closed, right? So light is produced in the mind, and that is something that is, foundationally very difficult to comprehend for a lot of people, even though everybody dreams, or most people dream. And if you go, well, where does that light come from? And if you go, well, in atomic physics, the atomic decay process releases a photon of light. So I've kind of gone, well, let's start looking at the atomic physics processes of light that are happening within biology in order to understand where that light is being generated and how that creates the 3D image of reality. And you really have to go down into the electromagnetic field of an atom, right? You have to look at how does electromagnetism get put into an atom. And, if you spend long enough looking at the biology, you can see, well, we have neurotransmitters, and neurotransmitters have some very interesting functionality in them. Case in point being dopamine. So dopamine has a hexagon ring, or a aromatic ring, which is this structure that contains 6 carbons in a cyclic structure of a hexagon, and it has pi electrons that kind of are delocalized. They travel round and round the ring. So you've got this essentially a donut-like structure, and you also have another functional group in chemistry called an amine, and that is on an extended arm from the aromatic ring. So I'm just trying to provide context of what it looks like visually. So that arm can be raised above the ring structure, and the amine can be in 2 different forms. One form is NH2, so it has 2 hydrogens, and the other form, it can be in NH3+, so it can be positively charged and have an extra hydrogen, and it receives that hydrogen from water. So when it is in that NH3+ state, it's considered to be protonated or contain hydrogen. And the process that I started to get really interested in was how that hydrogen can be added into the ring structure. So within the ring, there's only room for 1 atom, and there's this relationship that I found between the biblical story of the Passion of Christ carrying the cross, falling 3 times, and the relationship of the atomic amine in dopamine being at the 3rd layer in the passion lines of structure. So all of a sudden, the science that I knew provided context for a biblical story in the Passion of Christ. And so there's the passion lines in hydrogen as the 3rd layer, and the atomic amine NH3 falling 3 times in the process of quantum tunneling. So I started really trying to explore the relationship between science and religion, looking at both, because I knew science pretty well, biology wise, but I didn't grow up religious, wasn't baptized, met my wife in 1999, Guy Fawkes night, and she was Catholic, introduced me to that faith, And it took me years, at least a decade, before I was willing to consider, I guess, being baptized. And I guess that introduction to a different way of looking at the world through that lens of Christianity, that dogma, as well as the scientific dogma, and trying to reconcile between the two, has placed me in a position of, well, how do I look at the world scientifically, but through the lens of that Christian perspective? And so what I ended up doing was looking at the structure of the cross in terms of the geometry of positron-electron pairs within the structure of an atom. So how did I kind of get to that stage? If you think about Einstein and E equals mc squared, I rearranged that to make it c squared equals E divided by m, or rise over run on a mathematical cross. So I connected the geometry of electromagnetism, E divided by m, as a geometry of a cross within the structure of s orbitals within hydrogen. And so I built a model for hydrogen as a cross. And when I looked at the symmetry between the E and M and the negative E and the negative M in that structure, I was able to see 2 photons of light. At right hand, yeah, that's the image there. So essentially you can get the Z dimension as photons of light coming out of the center of an atom. So I started thinking about how this geometry of electromagnetism, the interaction between the electric field and the magnetic field talked about by Maxwell, and then the Planck scale. So in science, in physics, they talk about the resolution of the Planck length being just after the beginning of time, after the Big Bang. And so I was, I guess, trying to figure out how to integrate a science perspective and a spiritual, religious, Christian perspective into a single model in order to understand how it all fits together, really. So, I was doing work as a scientist, trying to make discoveries on regenerative medicine. And I guess the relationship between light within the structure of the atom and the electromagnetic force, the relationship to biblical information about Christ being a healer, the role of a cross geometry, positron-electron pairing in the structure of hydrogen, and that relationship with dopamine and the delivery of hydrogen and isotope formation and isotope decay, allowed me to kind of go, hey, hold on a sec. What if measurement has impacted the geometry of the structure of an atom in the positron-electron pairing and the electromagnetic field? And what we have developed in biology is a model for an electron, a proton, and a neutron, and that's what science has developed for the atom. But if we have a model where we change the quark charge calculations, so quarks make up the components of protons and neutrons, and if you have a look at what the current standard model of physics for biology uses for quarks, it's just an up quark and a down quark, and the charge charges on those. If it's up, it's plus 2/3, and if it's down, it's negative 1/3, and you add them together and you get a +1 for a proton and a 0 for a neutron. My, I guess, inspiration and the spiritual experience that I had at church in 2013 led me to go, what if we change the quark charge calculations to make them consistent with positron and electron, so +1 and -1. And if it's pointed up, it's -1 because it's the opposite to the field. And if it's pointed down, it's +1. And I multiply them together. I get a +1 for a proton, all good, but I get a -1 for a neutron. And then I kind of looked a little bit further in the mass of the neutron compared to the mass of the proton, and I saw the neutron was bigger. So I made an assumption that the bigger mass was actually due to the presence of a positron. And actually the -1 charge on the neutron and the +1 charge on the proton is what holds them together. And so all of a sudden, a different geometry. I had a cross-based geometry within the structure of atoms, and I could understand then how atomic decay of an unstable isotope that had more protons than neutrons, or more neutrons than protons, had more positrons than electrons, or electrons than positrons. And only when the number of neutrons and electrons are equal and positrons and protons are equal, that the atom has the same charge of 0, and that's a stable state. So I created a new geometry within the structure of an atom in order to understand really how electron and positron pairs are key to understand the geometry of the electromagnetic field within the structure of atoms. So that led me to kind of go back and look at the concept of he is the king of creation, he the father, the idea of God in the Christian Bible. And for me, I go, well, he as a scientist, I look at he as helium, and helium-4 okay. So because I changed the quark charge calculations, and I've made the neutron -1, and I've reintroduced the positrons into the atom to see the electromagnetic fields, I ended up going, well, if helium has 2 neutrons, it should have 2 positrons. And there's a form of energy known as a Bose-Einstein condensate. And so I went, okay, if helium contains 2 protons, 2 neutrons, 2 electrons, and 2 protons, it has this structure that has 16, right? So it has 16 electrons as a Bose-Einstein condensate. And I started playing around with that to try to figure out its relationship to dark matter, dark energy, and how to understand how this original form of energy that has no contrast, so it's all one thing, provides context for the biblical information that he, the Father, created both the heaven and the earth. So, I'm looking at a model, a scientific model that's aligned with a biblical teaching that's different from science only through changing quark charge calculations. And what I found is with alpha particle emission, so the alpha and the omega, the alpha particle is emitted at a particular speed that it's 10 times faster than the speed of light. So it could account for the inflationary phase of the universe. It has a ratio of 12 going out, the 12 disciples, and 4 going in. And so you go, well, that's a 3-on-1 ratio. What do we have in hydrogen? We have the 3 quarks on the inside and 1 electron on the outside. We have a 3-on-1 ratio, but it's an inverted symmetry. So I saw the model that I created from this changing of quark charges as being symmetry model, in a sense, a way that I was able to identify what dark matter was and dark energy.
Oh, okay. That was a long lecture. I must admit,
And so,
much of it is beyond me because I simply don't have the training. I don't have the scientific training. Here and there, I kind of hear reminiscing like of maybe a bit of Heisenberg or the little bits that I know of the quantum or science in general. But let me just try to recap for the listener who like me is not really trained within the area but is fascinated by the idea. So you had a spiritual experience in 2013.
that the latest imagery from the James Webb showing that the galaxies at the furthest distance of 13.5 billion light years are new. They're small. They're smaller than what they expected. And the reason for that is the decay of alpha particles forms matter. So as the alpha particles are getting further and further away from us, they're decaying. And as they not only a decay of the alpha particle, but you get the decay of the Planck particle as an inverted symmetry. And the two are quantumly entangled from that initial beginning point, and hence they are drawn toward each other. So the model provides also a really interesting aspect. The distance between the original electrons in the helium Bose-Einstein condensate was 4 e to the negative 14 meters. Okay, so there is a distance known as the Planck length, which I think is what the Planck particle was created. And the distance that the original electrons, and they're traveling for 13.8 billion years at the square root of the speed of light. So because it's coming from both sides toward each other, it's actually at the square root of the speed of light. It has created a distance corresponding to the Planck scale. So the model that I've developed provides evidence to support that the Planck length is generated from the flow of light in the electrons traveling in an implosion toward themselves at half the speed of the original alpha particle decay. And so all of a sudden it's like, okay, here we have an inverted symmetry atomic based model for a helium Bose-Einstein condensate that gives me numbers relating to dark matter, dark energy. I can calculate the background energy of the universe. That's 1 e to the negative 120. I can calculate the speed of light. It gives the inflationary phase of the universe based on 10 times the speed of light, because the alpha particle is emitted at 10 times the speed of light. You get a negative time dilation, which is that expansionary phase. It provides context for the continued expansion of the universe and creation of matter from alpha particle decay. After 13.8 billion years, based on the half-life of the alpha particle being 10 to the 17 seconds and the universe being 10 to the 18 seconds old, what we get is a 7.26% decay. And that, for me, corresponds beautifully to the original 75% alpha particle, dark energy, 7% decay, giving to 68% dark energy, which is what cosmology has identified as really the composition of dark energy present in the universe after 13.8 billion years. So the model I've developed came to me from the spiritual experience. And that's the weird thing. Where did that occur? That occurred on the cross at church. And changing the atomic structure of the atom into that cross-based symmetry led me to experience my own alpha particle decay in my mind from an atom called half an irium. it's 7236.
Keryn, that's amazing. That's so amazing.
That's 5 times the speed of light. So I experienced 43 years of information to 2055 from 2013 in 23 milliseconds. So that's the experience that I had that essentially showed me a golden sphere of light, got me down into the Lineman lines of vision, from the Balmer line visible down into the UV n equals 1, seeing that golden sphere, and then coming back to normal vision and having a download of images of future events in my life as that atom decayed and that time reversal symmetry.
Whoa. Okay, let me just recap on that, because this is like, so you had a spiritual experience in 2013 within a church.
Yep. Going up to receive communion.
Where you have experienced a negative time dilation, where the time got an expanse of time got compressed, and you were aware of all of that happening, and what? So what was the experience of it? What was the phenomenology of it? You were in the church, and in one moment you're looking at the cross, and what happened then? That moment.
I was breathing fast. I was having to hold on to the pew because, in a sense, something was happening within me I had no control over, right? I started walking up to receive communion. I looked at the figure of Christ as a paper mache statue on a cross at church. My mirror neurons, in a sense, locked my physical body into that structure. So when that happened, that's when that doorway within opened up to see the golden sphere, right? So
the golden sphere, you mean around the halo?
No. This is in front of me, about 5 meters or so in front of me. It was like a golden sun, 2 meters tall, with 2 other orbital electrons on either side. Essentially, I got to see within the atomic universe of an atom down at the.
So you got a model of a model of an atom, a vision of the model of an atom. Mm-hmm.
As the atom decayed, light came out of it to give me images of the future, and it started of each, I guess, part of that decay in a way that it provides snippets of information like signposts on a road that you are traveling.
Right.
So all of a sudden I have an experience of deja vu. That was one of the images that I saw back in 2013. And they were very strange, some of the images. One of them was a hole in the ground filled with golf balls. And you think, well, that was a very bizarre and unlikely scenario. But there's a driving range out near Petone in Wellington, and we have penguins here, and they live in burrows under flax bushes, and it so happened that it's been collecting golf balls for a number of years, and there were over 250 golf balls in this penguin burrow. So it was like there are lots of these kind of weird images that have come true in my life, and I've had to figure out how the hell that happened and try to reconcile with that with a Western framework of knowledge of science that I've learned in a scientific community that thinks that people who have experiences like that are crazy.
Crazy.
So
just repeat. You said because the last bit you said, yes, the material, the physicalist science, or as the paradigm is, in the West, doesn't really have the language or a conceptual framework to make sense of those kinds of experiences or these kinds of synchronicities. So it relegates it it relegates it to the realm of the spirit or something that isn't scientific. But for you, there was no you had to reconcile, like you said, those two dimensions of life that were equally real, and you knew they were real, right?
Yeah. Yep, because the human retina point inward, we see light within the mind. It, that experience gave me the insight for negative time dilation, that atomic decay process. And for that to be real, then the functionality of the amine and dopamine to deliver hydrogen to create the isotope makes rational sense. And if you think about the time required for the conscious mind to reconcile all the information, it needs time to stitch things together to create reality. And to do that, it utilizes the physics time delay. So light travels in and you get the deja vu experience. Light comes back out. And the flow of time is happening in one direction, typically, which is from high energy to low energy. So it gives you the arrow of time in the atomic decay process. And occasionally you get the deja vu experience of, oh, that's weird. I thought I've already experienced that. And that gives context for the light going in to begin with. And it gives context for atomic decay being the source of light in dreams at night with our eyes closed, and the retina picking up the information from the decayed process. So it started out really as a let's reconcile the spiritual experience that I had with a deeper understanding of the mind and how it operates mechanistically in a scientific, westernized perspective, because that's the language that I know about. And then build, I guess, a framework based on cross-based inverted symmetry. And you think about our own biology, the mirrored symmetry between the two sides of our bodies, and the idea of the inverse square law, Newtonian physics. And you go, okay, there's a relationship between isotope decay, the light going in, coming out, inverse square law, and our mirrored symmetry. So the biology of isotopes and the way isotopes are formed through hydrogen gave me context for the biological framework that I've developed through the cross and seeing it as two photons of light. So in the Bible, they talk about the animals going 2 by 2. So I think there are other relationships that point to the understanding that was present 2,000 years ago in relation to the spiritual understanding of how the mind works. You know, understanding Plato's cave, how we're looking inward rather than outward. Mm-hmm. And so I've had to really go, well, the human retina, the lipid responsible for cis-trans isomerization and a signal is very similar to the polyunsaturated fatty acids that are present within the lipid membranes of the neurons within the mind. So is it the light being generated in the isotope decay external to the neuron that's responsible for creating the image observed? And so I've really looked at the process of isotope decay to generate photons of light, and that photon is key to understand how biology moves from one place to another. So if you think about an atom like oxygen in the blood and bound to iron and it being red, and the mitochondria that uses oxygen absorbs red light. So those photons of light are able to be generated from oxygen to migrate the oxygen into the mitochondria. So there is, I think, a lot more happening within the biology of light and biophotons through a standing, if you have a look at the structure of the heme porphyrin ring with the iron in the center, and then 4 nitrogens in a cross-based geometry. Biology's figured out how to utilize the light structure within atoms and provide a way of sending photons from one place to another in order to facilitate communication. And if you've seen any of my videos that I have on my YouTube channel in relation to biophoton production or the quantum entanglement, so I've developed a product from Manuka honey that is, in a sense, quite strange because of its ability to generate water. So that has this process within it that's called photofenton chemistry. And the photofenton chemistry uses iron, uses hydrogen peroxide, and uses light to photoreduce a single atom of iron from Fe3 to Fe2, generates a compound called the hydroxy radical. And the hydroxy radical has a half-life of 1 nanosecond, and it's got such power to break down all biological molecules back into CO2 and water. And this is what biology actually uses to break down cells in a process called apoptosis. It's known as pre-programmed cell death. And it's what removes damaged cells from our bodies. So the technology I've developed is really to utilize this light-based, high-energy radical system to break down cells to support healing and regeneration within the human body. And if you think about, well, what happened to me was I had trauma in my life back in when I was a child, when I was 11. The product that I was working on has this power to produce a hydroxy radical that can open up the aromatic ring of a neurotransmitter to release the trapped light that was in there. So the trauma was released when that hydroxy radical broke open the aromatic ring and released the photons that I saw. So it was connected to really the science of regeneration and healing that I was doing as a scientist. Nobody told me that I should be prepared for having a spiritual experience from using this product. And, you know, I had to find out for myself. And that was the journey I had to walk, right? So having experienced it for myself, it gave me context for develop the science of light within the mind, within the structure of atoms, isotope decay processes for memory formation and recall. You think about how all of a sudden you remember something out of the blue and you haven't been thinking about it. Well, yeah, that's because isotope decay is all timed based on half-lives of these atoms that are housed within the aromatic rings, and they release their light. When they release their light, the experience of our past informs us of, you know, certain circumstances and how to behave. So the science of light within the mind got revealed to me when I had that experience. And so I've had to really go, I no longer believe in the external physical model that Western science has gone and developed. I have to reconcile with the experience that I had. In order to make sense of it, I had to put positrons back into the atomic structure. And then now I've got a logical model, and I have this model that shows these single atoms housed in the aromatic rings are storing memories. I can give my product to people and they can remove trauma from their own body and their stored memories. And it's fascinating to think that the smaller you go, the higher the energy there is in physics. So when you get down to a single atom housed in that aromatic ring, you got to think, well, it receives hydrogen, it creates an isotope. that isotope might have a half-life of a nanosecond or a femtosecond or a picosecond. It really depends what that atom is. And so it's receiving that light and then it releases it. And so all of the kind of high energy atomic physics.
Because we're nearing the end. There's so much information there. I need to do a lot of extra research anyway to the microstructure of your research. But obviously I'm trying to make sense of what I do understand. And it seems to me, can you just confirm that since you've lost faith in the purely mechanistic, materialistic model of the universe after your experience, because you had to reconcile the metaphysical with the physical, what has made it possible for you to do the Susi inversion was to view the world in an electromagnetic as an electromagnetic system rather than a physical system. Is that accurate? Would that be accurate?
Yeah. I looked with the structure of light within the atom, and obviously the first atom of the periodic table is hydrogen, and hydrogen is really the only atom that quantum tunnels. So understanding the geometry of a cross is what's critical to understand quantum tunneling. So that's how biology puts light into an atom to create the isotope and then brings light back out of the atom through that geometry. So there's this thing called the UV catastrophe where more energy comes out than is going in. And there's this amazing, the more light you put into that atom within that aromatic ring, that hexagon ring system, the closer and closer the electron and positron pairs get together. So you can grow atoms up the periodic table. And as they get further and further up the periodic table through that process of putting hydrogen in and growing them from the bottom, that leads to really high energy isotope decay. And these energies are millions of electron volts. So it gives the experience of transcendence. It gives the experience of seeing future events in your life. For me, I had to figure out how a negative time dilation gives you faster than light vision. From that atomic decay happening within the mind, what you see is literally you're immersed in a different time and you experience it. My personal experience was for a very, very short period of time. So it wasn't like I was there for days or weeks. No, I was there for such a short time that nobody saw me leave. All happened within my mind. It was completely overwhelming, and that released that trauma of my past. So it was an experience.
Right, because I remember from the Einstein's theory of relativity that in order to time travel, you must exceed the speed of light, right? Which seems to be the process involved in what you're talking about.
Yeah, the atomic decay of alpha particles is faster than light. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Which then facilitates the negative time dilation for the whoever. Mm-hmm. Right. So do you think that given that this is a paradigm shifting discovery, we don't know how many more. Do you have any colleagues that have had similar discoveries and have done similar work within this field?
Like Manuka honey has typically been touted as a health food product, oral, and the level of this compound called methylglyoxal has been, I guess, built up by the industry as the functional active ingredient. But if you have a look at the scientific literature around methylglyoxal, you see both the negative aspects of it as well in relation to diabetes and advanced glycation end products, rage, inflammation activation. All I discovered under a microscope this light-based photophenton system generating hydroxy radicals. And then you look at the scientific literature around hydroxy radicals, and they say they're damaging to cells and they lead to disease. And you go, well, I can't reconcile between Western science, hydroxy radical, and the health-giving benefits of manuka honey and photophenton chemistry. Something's got to be wrong. And if you look deeper, you go into apoptosis, pre-programmed cell death is involved. It requires hydroxy radicals. You look at the phagocytosis process of antibacterial activity, antiviral activity. It is based on hydroxy radicals. There are other technologies that are used to remediate after house fires, and they use hydroxyl radical generators, and they're safe to use around people. The FDA have approved them. So, Western science has created the idea that antioxidants are good for us, but I think that antioxidants are actually stopping apoptosis. And if you stop apoptosis, which is pre-programmed cell death, you're going to create aged cell body. So if you stimulate this photophenton system, what I found is that I generated quantumly entangled fluids that change their structure depending on the wavelengths of light that I looked at the material with. And if you think about, well, apoptosis produces apoptotic bodies, which are these small kind of extracellular vesicles that travel around the body and go into all these different cells. So in a way, it's created a quantumly entangled communication system to create the body into a holistic working as one, rather than, so that sacrifice of cell death and apoptosis is actually a communication system to enable a holism, in a sense, in a community of many billions of cells to work collectively together in a quantumly entangled way. And that's a completely kind of different paradigm shift again, away from what biology teaches and the dogma of DNA to messenger RNA to, protein, and the dogma of that versus the dogma of, I guess, quantum biology is that there's this dynamic reciprocity even in the light structure within the atomics of isotopes. And it's that isotope physics that's responsible for the geometry of our biology. And there will be a relationship, I think, between the amount of energy that's released and the inverse square law, right? So that Newtonian physics of c squared, when c squared equals r squared, we can substitute the Newtonian gravity in the relationship to light between electron and positron pairs within the structure of the atom. And so I've really kind of been learning intuitively as well as mathematically, scientifically, how to build a new scientific framework of isotope physics into biology and start again from that cross-based geometry in order to understand the implications of the biology we see, which is coming from the light released within those single atoms, and how that's connected to water structure within our biology. And where does the water come from? Well, that's the food that we eat. And so there's a very simple relationship. We eat food to produce both ATP and water, and then we use the hydrogen and water that's been produced in that process to create the atoms within the structure of our very existence, our physical beings created from water through the generation of water in ATP formation in the mitochondria. And so there's a lot more that I guess can be said and a lot more understood. There's a lot of information on my website in relation to the science behind the product, its cognitive benefits, the biology, and how it operates through the fields of light within our cells. And rather than trying to explain the complexity, I think it's actually better for people to kind of try the product for themselves and experience the increased energy, the pain relief, the long-term benefits of use come to that deeper cognitive appreciation, the balance that one finds in their life through the use of the product. That's probably some of the feedback that people have given me, is they feel more connected to themselves, they feel more balance. It's fascinating. It takes time. I've seen people come to tears when they use the product because of the pain relief properties that it can give within seconds topically. And it stops the communication between the neuron and the macrophage inflammatory cell. So it switches off macrophages, it stops inflammation. So it has some pretty profound benefits. And it's like, because it's so deeply connected to a spiritual experience that I had in order to kind of figure out how this product works, I have had to kind of walk that journey myself in order to understand it. And now I'm getting to the stage of being able to share product with others and get them to have the chance to have their own journey. And it's inspiring to see the changes that it's happening in other people's lives as well, as it has, I guess, to me and my own healing.
Amazing. So thank you for your time. I'm sure we should talk more. I have many questions, but I was glad to hear you actually, explain and give the background of your science and the amazing. Well, I don't know your products, but the last question I have for you, how much, provided this is the actual way, because we already see that the physicalist model of the universe is kind of breaking down. Like people are deeply unhappy, and the ideas of the Cartesian Newtonian physics are perhaps becoming invalid, but at the same time there are huge industries built around them, right? So which has to run its course. This paradigm has to run its course. How much do you give humanity, how much time until this kind of stuff becomes mainstream? What is your prediction?
I would love it to be within 2 years. But there's a battle going on at the moment, as you're probably well aware. And, we have to be completely open and honest and hold that integrity, and let people pull it to pieces, right? Let people look at it, let people evaluate the technology and the product and how it's operating. And that's what science does. Science looks at it, goes, okay, this is your model you've developed. Okay, this is the logic behind it. Here's the framework. Does it make sense? Does it make sense in terms of Well, in quantum physics, we cannot identify both the position and speed of an electron. And in that aromatic ring system where there's only a single atom, if you don't interact with it, then it comes back to a stable state. And that stable state has a known geometry based on Newtonian physics. So you can actually identify down at the Planck length scale the location of the electron and its speed. And when you start doing that, it's quite different, right? It's because it's a single atom system operating, and because it's receiving hydrogen, the isotope decay process is based on its half-life. And so in an isolated environment, which is what the aromatic ring system is, it's a quantumly clean environment. It operates with some very well-defined parameters and mechanics, because it's been built on uncertainty, it's been built on statistics and probability. And here I'm saying, well, I'm doing non-interactive logic. I'll get to a zero state balance point where the atom, in a sense, is at equilibrium, where it has no mass, no charge, but it is essentially the geometry of light within the structure of that hexagon ring. And when I know what that is, I can understand the features of that particular atom and how biology releases light from it through its half-life decay process. And then that corresponds to if it's faster than light, it will give a negative time dilation. If it's slower than light, it will give a perception of time based on a distance. So there's very interesting information that potentially is available, scientifically, to go, okay, this atom, this isotope gives this decay parameters that corresponds to 1 over, a number in seconds. So for me, that 23 milliseconds is 1 over 0.023, which equals 43. And for me, that corresponded to a 43-year period of information that was downloaded. So it's rooted in the science of time dilation and those calculations. And it's based on the binding kinetics of isotope decay that physics has already determined. So the numbers are already there. I don't need to measure. I already have access to that information. And I can convert the binding kinetic information into kilojoules per mole, which makes it relevant to biology. And in doing so, I've developed a kilojoules per mole based velocity for atomic decay. And that's the number that I use for the time dilation in relevance to the speed of light squared. Also there, when you get too far out ahead of everybody else in the scientific community, you're ostracized and kind of created a barrier for others to understand, because you haven't got a language that they can relate to. So you kind of have to backfill, right? You create your wall and you've jumped over it, you've quantum tunneled through it, and then you have to come back and try to connect people back to the model that they do know and bring them forward to a model that is new, which allows them to have a look, and it's their choice whether they want to look or not,
right.
And perceive from somebody else's perspective. Yeah, you can't force anybody to kind of go on that journey, right? It's our own safety net, in a sense, in that Western science, to stay grounded in that materialism, that external physical. And I think that's going to take some time to break down. Yeah.
Right. There's a very strong tradition of security being within that materialist paradigm, yeah. Right? And maybe for you and I had my own kind of spiritual experiences, and I've been struggling within my own field to reconcile, the rigid rationality of philosophy with the spirituality of religion, and some thinkers we discussed, like Hegel and Nietzsche and others, tried to kind of. I've been striving, and we are continuing doing it. So it's been very fascinating listening to you, and from the scientific community as you are, and it sounds like an amazing job you're doing, and I look forward to tasting some of your or trying out some of your products soon. So maybe we can have a chat about that later on. What will benefit me best?